This is part 2 in what is going to be a series now at this point, because not only am I going to keep updating my spreadsheet, I'm also going to be updating my opinions. So thanks to your guys' feedback, let me go ahead and update some things that I realize in hindsight I glossed over a bit too quickly in the first video. So to start off, I want to try and clarify something about yaw plus roll in local space, in the off chance I accidentally confused any of you with my examples in the first video. All I'm showing here is that your controller does not stay aligned with the game world the same way it would if you were to use a gravity style. For it to be synchronized like the gravity style, our controller would have to be pointing forward. But as you can see, it's pointing to the side. And this kind of behavior causes some specific quirks that you have to look out for if you plan on using these styles. So we can see the difference rather clearly here with laser pointer. And something else to keep in mind is that performing simple actions like drawing a circle can feel very different depending on the style that you're using, especially with yaw plus roll, because depending on the physical motions you actually make, sometimes yaw and roll can actually fight each other. So the default contribution setting is something that you'll have to feel out for yourself if you plan on using these styles. While not the same thing, we can see a similar effect happen with world space and laser pointer. So because camera rotation is essentially 2D with just pitch and yaw, it means that even though world space and laser pointer are technically more realistic, it means that there's a sort of 3D factor that the in-game camera can't handle whenever the pitch axis is used for yaw rotation, and this small imperfection can build up over time, unless you can rotate your controller in an absolutely perfect circle. So interestingly, this means that player space is the only style where it's very easy to draw a consistent circle without deviating from your starting point. This is because this style essentially locks you into like grid-like rotation, which is less realistic, but it's more consistent. And if you want my quick opinion here, I still feel that laser pointer is better for aiming at stuff that's in front of you, but player space is great if you're constantly tracking stuff that is circling around you, which you'll see later in this video. Also, I think I changed my mind. If you're measuring your wrist arc with normal controllers like you see here, then use this style instead. So I only really made that first video because I wanted to explain the stuff about my spreadsheet, which is why I wound up skipping some stuff that was here in Steam Input. In hindsight, I should have just gone ahead and covered everything, because I did skip over some obvious stuff. So I'll do that now. So starting off with invert Y and invert X output, these two settings are pretty self-explanatory. These settings just reverse the output of pitch and yaw rotation. So invert Y is your pitch axis. And invert X is your yaw. The next option I skipped was enable momentum. This is basically the same setting as the trackball setting for touchpads. So I've lowered the setting here to show you exactly what it does. So basically, if you disable the gyro while you're rotating, the output will continue for a little bit, kind of like spinning a trackball. So you can adjust this for horizontal rotation and vertical. And the way to think about this is the more you lower this setting, the longer your mouse will spin. And if you lower this all the way down to 0, your mouse will spin forever. So going to the right increases friction. Going to the left decreases it. The next setting I skip is trigger press mouse dampening. This is the feature that is specifically meant for the Steam controller, because if we open up our options here, you'll see these options here for right and left trigger soft pull and right and left trigger full pull. So what this is referring to is the Steam controller's triggers. So a soft pull is when you pull a trigger halfway. This is just a normal analog trigger. And when you pull the Steam controller's trigger all the way down, there's an extra button. This is the full pull trigger. And this is an insanely useful feature. And so going back to our options here, what these settings refer to is what stage of the trigger pull do you want your sensitivity to be lowered? So I'm going to pick right trigger soft pull. So now we have a percentage slider that determines how much our sensitivity is going to be lowered. Right now it's set to 90%. So in game, you can see that my gyro is calibrated to 1:1. And if I pull the trigger, you can see that my sensitivity immediately lowers. And because the setting is only on the soft pull, if I pull the trigger all the way down, my sensitivity increases back to normal, until I go back to a soft pull and release the soft pull. So if you increase this to 100%, we completely disable our output. And going to 0 changes nothing at all. So from what I've tested, this doesn't actually work with my PlayStation 4 controller, but if I remember correctly, these settings should work with the PlayStation 5's adaptive triggers. So I'd just like to bring up one thing real quick right here. It is baffling to me that there is not a setting for full pull dampening only, because that's honestly the only reason why I've never really used this feature ever. To me, that just seems like the most obvious way that someone would use this type of sensitivity adjustment on dual stage triggers. So the next setting is movement threshold. And honestly, I have never used this setting. At least not the mouse version of this. Basically, if you remember what I said about dead zones in the first video, apparently some games have native dead zones that will filter out small mouse movements. And this setting is designed to counteract those dead zones. I have yet to find a single game that actually does this with mouse input. However, I do remember that I did use the joystick version of this setting. And if I remember right, it was one of the Metro games. So it's super rare, but if you ever run into a game where slow movements don't seem to move your mouse, then you might want to experiment with this. And finally, the last settings all have to do with haptic feedback. With controllers that have HD rumble, we can use these settings to give us more feedback for our gyro motions. Haptic intensity controls how strong your controller will vibrate based on your degrees per haptic bump. So now with this setup, my controller will vibrate every 5 degrees. So as I rotate my controller, I can feel a haptic bump every 5 degrees. So you can think of this setting like a haptic feedback grid. And this could be very useful for building up muscle memory, because the human brain likes feedback, whether it's visual feedback, auditory feedback, or in this case, touch feedback. Our brain takes all that information together in order to build up muscle memory. So this is a setting I would recommend if you're trying to build up muscle memory. And it's also a setting that I think could be improved, because there are some quirks to this that I'm not going to point out. So at a setting of 1 degree, my controller will now vibrate every 1 degree. However, if I increase my gyro sensitivity, let's say to 2, I've noticed that this also scales the haptic bump. So now, instead of vibrating every 1 degree, it'll vibrate every 2 degrees. So in my opinion, I think it would be more useful if this setting just stayed calibrated to 1:1, regardless of sensitivity. And there is one more idea I have for this, although I don't know if it should be applied to this setting exactly. So my idea is to control haptic intensity with controller rotation speed. Think of it like this. If you're rotating your controller slowly, the controller vibrates just a little bit. And the faster you rotate your controller, the more intense the vibration becomes. And if you scale that with the mouse acceleration curve, I think this could help people develop muscle memory with mouse acceleration much quicker, as it gives them a bit of feedback and further understanding of what mouse acceleration is doing to their sensitivity. This would probably have to be a unique setting specifically for mouse accel, because I don't know if I'd want this setting to change. All right, and finally, the last setting is just haptic activation. All these settings do is they let you know when your gyro is turned on or off. So when you turn on your gyro, your controller vibrates. When you turn off your gyro, it vibrates. Or when you're doing both. It's fairly straightforward. Although right now, it doesn't seem to actually work with my Steam controller. So I think that's another bug. Now, I did skip gyro activation though. And this setting is also straightforward. You just select the buttons that you want to affect your gyro, and then you select how you want those buttons to affect your gyro. Either enabling it, disabling it, or using those buttons as a toggle. So I could talk about this setting more and the approach to gyro activation, but I've decided I'm just going to go ahead and save that for a future video. And I think that should pretty much cover everything in Steam Input for now. Alright, so hindsight is 2020, and I realize I could have done a better job of explaining why I'm doing the math here the way I am, specifically in regards to scaling the dots per 360 and not the sensitivity. So let me explain some mathematical concepts that will clarify the problems we're running into when we try to scale sensitivity to feel the same on 2D space as it does in 3D. So this meme actually highlights a bit of the paradox of what we're trying to do. If we have a circle with a circumference of pi, so 3.14 and so on, and then we have a square around it with a perimeter of 4, then the joke is, if you keep scaling down the square, then eventually pi will be equal to 4. But this just isn't true. Pi is always going to be equal to pi, 3.14, and so on. And the reason why has to do with the concept of fractals, because no matter how many corners you cut off the square, even to infinity, which infinity is not technically a number, it's a representation of a concept of an idea, which, I mean, isn't that what a number is? Whatever. A square is always going to be a square. It's just that at a certain distance, it'll look like a circle. But if you zoom in close enough, it's still a square with a bunch of corners. And this is part of the reason why it's impossible to make 2D sensitivity feel exactly the same as 3D without doing some extra math. And so a much more accurate representation of the exact problem we're running into is the coastline paradox. So the way this paradox works is that if you measure the perimeter of a coastline with a large ruler, you will get a certain distance. In this example, it's 2,800 kilometers. Now, if you use a smaller ruler and you measure the exact same coastline, somehow that coastline gets longer at 3,400 kilometers. And you can repeat this pattern to infinity because the smaller and smaller ruler you use, the longer and longer the coastline becomes. And this is a very similar concept to what's happening when we try to scale 2D sensitivity to feel like our 3D FOV. So I've updated the graphics that I showed in the first video to more effectively communicate exactly what's happening here, because I actually realized I did say something wrong in the first video. Also, my visual example for vertical FOV was wrong because I instinctively just used the same screen graphic as the horizontal FOV, but I forgot that I needed to scale the screen size to be relative to the FOV we're simulating. So I've corrected that here. In the first video, I basically said that the circumference of the circle determines sensitivity that we're going to use. That's kind of correct, but the circle itself doesn't actually represent the sensitivity we're using. What actually represents the sensitivity is the distance we're traveling on the 2D plane of the screens, not the 3D space. And the sensitivity changes based on whether we're using the horizontal distance, the vertical distance, or the diagonal distance. And these measurements are different because of the coastline paradox. I then take the average of all three distances, and this gives us a sensitivity that feels closest to what we experience in 3D space, although it's not exactly the same. Even in these examples here, you can see that the dots are only synchronized at 3 points if you look closely, at the center of the screen and at the edges of the screen. Everywhere else, calibration will still be slightly off, so we can only get a close approximation of what we experience in-game. Again, it's impossible to perfectly emulate 3D motion on 2D space without doing a bunch of extra math, which is why I actually updated something else in my spreadsheet that I realized I got wrong because I did it way too simple, but I'll get to that in a bit. Alright, so thanks to your feedback, I realized that I actually could scale these sensitivities just using the gyro sensitivity. So I did go ahead and add these settings for you to just type in your dots per 360, and now you'll have an average gyro sensitivity or a split sensitivity. And I did the same thing for Wiimote as well. But there is a reason why I was scaling the dots per 360, and so I'll explain that to you now. Because if you're new to Steam Input, I accidentally did gloss over something kind of important. And it's one of Steam Input's most useful features, mouse detection. So, other than Steam controller support, one of the biggest reasons why Steam Input is still my go-to, despite all the changes Valve has made to it, is mouse detection. Now, mouse detection lets us have two completely different sets of bindings that change automatically based on whether or not a mouse is on the screen. And so this lets us use two completely different sensitivities, one for gameplay and one for menus. Here's how you set it up. At the bottom left, you're going to select Action Sets. And you're going to add an action set. I always add an action set and I always label it menu. That's just what I do. If you're trying to do something specific, you can copy over your default bindings to your new action set, but we're not doing that this video. So I've already set up my two action sets and I already have them labeled. One for gameplay and one for menus. So now you're going to go to Global Set Options. And now you're just going to pick which set you want on when the mouse is on screen. So when the cursor is on the screen, I always use menu. And when the cursor is hidden, I always use gameplay. And so now, here's my sensitivity for my menu gyro. Here, I'm scaling my sensitivity for 98 degrees of FOV. And now if I show you my in-game sensitivity, you can see that I'm using a different sensitivity in-game. And now I can give you a visual example of how Rubber Band Sim actually works with this kind of setup. Okay, so now I'm going to try and perform the exact same motions both in-game and in the pause menu. Again, this is something you'll have to feel out for yourself. And so now let me show you how this also benefits the Steam controller. So this time, I'm going to use the same dots for 360 in gameplay and in the menu. So here's the sensitivity for gameplay. And here's the sensitivity for the menu. The difference is I'm scaling the sensitivity instead of the dots per 360. As for the touchpad, in the menu I'm using this sensitivity. And for gameplay, I'm using this sensitivity. So when I'm controlling the mouse, I have my touchpad set up to the full screen. Or just about, because I'm using the old mouse acceleration. And now here's the in-game touchpad. And now here's the gyro. And so if mouse detection works, it doesn't matter if you scale the dots per 360 or the sensitivity. You'll basically get the same results. However, there is a reason why I was scaling the dots per 360 first. And that reason is games with a real fake mouse. So here's a game called Warstride Challenges. And this game has what I like to call a real fake mouse. A real fake mouse looks like a mouse, it moves like a mouse, but to Steam input, it's not a real mouse. Here I've set up two action sets, a default for gameplay, and a completely blank layer as a test. You can see here that when the mouse is on the screen, the blank test layer should be on. However, it's not. The default layer is on, because to Steam input, the mouse is non-existent, because this is a real fake mouse. So what this means is that in games like this, we are forcibly locked into just using one layer to do all of our bindings. And for sensitivity, that means we have to use one sensitivity for both our 2D sensitivity and for our in-game 3D sensitivity. And that's why I scale the dots per 360 first. Because now, the dots per 360 are simulating the in-game sensitivity and the 2D sensitivity. Think of it like a one-way mirror. It's possible to scale 2D sensitivity to fit inside of 3D sensitivity, but you cannot scale 3D sensitivity to fit inside of 2D sensitivity. And so by using the 2D sensitivity here first for the dots per 360, that means any changes we make to the actual gyro sensitivity will always remain consistent. So you can see here I have a sensitivity of 6.71. And now in-game, just as I've shown before, the 2D mouse will be consistent with the 3D crosshair. And if for whatever reason you want to change your sensitivity, all you have to do is change your sensitivity. And the 2D mouse and the 3D crosshair will still stay relatively consistent. And so that solves sensitivity issues for the gyro. However, this does mean that we're using our in-game touchpad sensitivity for basic mouse control. And if you're using a 360 touchpad, this means that we're also using that same sensitivity for 2D control, which is another reason why I use Accel on the touchpad. All right, I hope this clarifies some things about why I'm doing things the way I am with these calculations. And if you want my recommendations, use this type of scaling if you're trying to remain consistent with your in-game settings. But if you want immersion and you're playing rail shooters like House of the Dead, then use Wiimote style. And with that, I think I can segue over to the next thing that I updated in my spreadsheet. So in the first video, I shared an idea for what you could possibly do to create a type of screen space gyro that has absolute positioning, that properly simulates a real laser pointer type of aiming. Problem is, I realized in hindsight that I was actually doing things way too simple. So I've gone back and I've corrected the math. So for real this time, down at the bottom left, this is the math you would need to do to create a true laser pointer mode. So based on the settings up top, to simulate an FOV of 90 degrees, we can now keep track of exactly where the mouse should be based on the angle that the controller is being held at. So on the roll axis, for example, at a default pitch of 0, if I rotate the controller 45 degrees, then we should be pointing at the right side of the screen. However, as you pitch the controller up, the FOV changes, which means the relative x-axis position should also change. So in this example, the mouse would actually be off the screen because the FOV actually becomes lower. And so now these two settings interact with each other correctly, the way I was actually describing in the first video. And below this is the exact same thing. It's just that I realized in order to actually calculate this math, you need to use one angle as a sort of anchor reference point. So down here, I'm using the horizontal rolling position as the reference. And up here, I'm using the pitch axis as the point of reference. And both of these give you the exact same results. So there you go. This is the actual math you would need for a real laser pointer mode. By the way, one more thing I updated was this section on McOSU. Since I know it's very tempting to use OS as an aim trainer, I went ahead and recommended this game that I found on Steam. It's free, by the way, and you can import everything from OS into it, and the game is called McOSU. And so I had a calculator here specifically for that game, but after uploading that video, I finally went back and actually checked that game again just to make sure my settings worked after the fact. and it seems like they broke something. So the converter I had here before just flat out doesn't work anymore. And after sitting down and like figuring things out manually, because mouse sensitivity doesn't work either, I finally figured out what is going on. So basically now in McOS, the centimeter thing that they're using is broken. It just flat out doesn't work. And this is actually a good thing for gyro, especially for Steam input, because now you just need to use this exact number and you can just type in whatever dots per 360 it is you're using in Steam input, and you will have the correct calibration now. And now to show you why I kind of brought up this game as a possible alternative, if you really do want to use OS as a name trainer, well, now I can show you why. Alright, so I think I picked a song here that won't get the MCA'd, but just in case, I'll talk over it anyways. So here, I'm simulating my in-game sensitivity of 6.71 using rubber band sim. So the first thing I like to address is the major problem you'll run into if you try and play OS without a drawing tablet. Both gyro and mouse are measuring changes in distance or speed in order to translate that motion into in-game mouse movement. And the unfortunate reality is, an effect known as mouse drift will take place. Not to be mistaken with gyro drift, which is when your mouse or crosshair will just start randomly moving on its own due to decalibration. Mouse drift is when your mouse is no longer synchronized with the position that you're holding the controller in. And this is a bad thing for games that require a ton of consistency. There's a reason why drawing tablets dominate in this game. And so another problem that arises is if you do use mouse acceleration for actual shooters. Now, for shooters, mouse acceleration is no problem, because in a real game, you're only ever pointing at one target at a time. And usually there's enough downtime between targets that you'll already have reset your gyro by that point. Because in a real game, you're basically never going to be shooting at more than one target at a time. Because if there's 3 targets in front of you, then you're already dead. But in a game like OS, we need consistency across long periods of time. So this does mean that whenever I play OS, I don't use mouse acceleration. I don't even use precision speed, at least not right now, because the program I made is already inconsistent of itself because of how jank it is. So I don't actually use that mouse acceleration program I made in any real games. I literally only made that as an example of what I want to see get implemented natively. If a native implementation ever does happen, then I absolutely will test the limits of using mouse accel in games like OS. Because I used to use Accel in OS with Steam Input's old mouse acceleration, and I used to do just fine. And so hopefully what I'm showing here in this example with this song is that even at a high flat sensitivity, you can get by just fine. And once I move on to McOS, you'll see why. By the way, quick tip. For spinners, you want to lock down your controller with one hand, and then with your dominant hand, you're gonna sort of vibrate the controller up and down. This creates an oval or circle pattern that lets you do spinners fairly consistently. And if you're wondering, yes, I have tried using the joystick for spinners. Problem is, switching from gyro to the joystick and then back to gyro mid-run is really hard, so it's better just to do everything with just the gyro. And at the end here, if you're wondering, I accidentally switched to a different action set, so that's what happened to my mouse there. I'll probably do a config video eventually, once Steam input is in a better place, in case you're curious. Alright, so here's a quick visual example of what mouse drift looks like, using mouse acceleration to help exaggerate the effect. So if I move my mouse to one side of the screen very slowly, then the mouse cursor and your actual mouse will stay relatively consistent. However, once I flick quickly back to the center of the screen, you can see that we're completely unsynchronized now. This is mouse drift. And yes, mouse acceleration does make this worse. And this is part of the reason why people always refer to mouse acceleration as being inconsistent. Although, in my opinion, the correct way to describe mouse acceleration is that it's consistently inconsistent. And so the thing to keep in mind is that this happens with or without mouse acceleration. So even at a flat sensitivity, you will eventually decalibrate, whether you're using a mouse or a gyro. Unless you have a form of absolute positioning, decalibration is essentially guaranteed. Okay, so for McOS, I did add one more setting to the calculator, and it's for distance, because McOS has this slider here that lets you adjust how far away from the camera the virtual 2D space will be. So if you want to ensure that the 2D space completely fills your screen, like it would in a 2D space, then this is the distance relative to your FOV that you would need to use. If you want the 2D space to fill half of your screen, so 45 degrees in this example, then this is the distance you use. And just to continue the pattern, this would be 1/4 of your screen. And again, relative to your FOV, if you want to scale the relative size of the 2D space to your screen to a specific amount, then you can just type in whatever number you want here. So in this example, the 2D space will be 3 times smaller than the screen. And by the way, this is how focal length scaling works. Okay, so now that everything is set up properly, you should be able to see some immediate differences. The biggest being that 3D aiming is very different from 2D aiming. In a 2D game like OS, you can see everything all at once, all at the same time. But because you're on a camera swivel rotating around in 3D space, this means that even just being able to see some targets at certain angles is really hard. The next thing to keep in mind is that this basically shows the true size of the targets that you're aiming at in OS. And what this means is that if you're using OS as an aim trainer, you're basically just training wide flicks to large targets. And this is the reason why I added the distance calculator for this game, because if you actually do want to train precision, you can just rescale the size of the 2D space.
Mission failed. We'll get them next time.
Yeah, this is way harder, even though the patterns are exactly the same. And so I did 2 more runs where I reduced the size of the 2D space. In this run, I've cut the screen space in half, so the targets are exactly half the size that they were before. And what's interesting is that relative to the last run, I only last half as long.
Mission failed. We'll get them next time.
And finally, for this last example, I'm at 1/4 the size, and guess what? I only last half the time relative to the last run. So again, if you want to use us as a name trainer, I do recommend you check this game out. And there actually is another game that's like this, but it's paid, so I think I'll probably do a standalone video about that game later in the future.
Mission failed. We'll get them next time.
Alright, so despite how much I've used gyro, I've honestly never bothered to look into seeing what the actual limitations of the sensors are, because personally, I care more about other features that a controller has more than just the gyro itself, because even if you have the best gyro sensor on the planet, that sensor is not going to do you a whole lot of good if it's literally inside of a potato. But I went ahead and finally sat down and looked into it because I wanted to look into whether or not using high sensitivities is actually a good idea or not. Because personally, I've never noticed a difference. And so here's what I've learned. So the first thing is, gyro doesn't work the same way as mouse, fundamentally. A mouse is essentially a small camera that records small changes in intervals over time, like 1000 hertz, and by measuring the difference between 2 images, a mouse then translates that into motion for the mouse on screen to move. And because the mouse is essentially a small camera, that's where the concept of DPI comes from. It's literally the resolution of the mouse sensor. And a lot of gaming mice have a hard limit, because if you think about it for a second, gaming mice that say they can go up to 32,000 dots or more, because that would mean the camera in your mouse is somehow higher than like a 16K display or something crazy like that. And that's just not physically possible right now. At least I don't think so. And so a lot of mice will actually fake sensitivity past a certain point. And this fake information can cause a lot of accuracy problems with gaming mice. Gyro, on the other hand, doesn't use a camera. A gyroscope measures angular velocity, and so the precision of a gyro sensor is determined by the smallest angle that sensor can measure. I mean, this is part of the reason why gyro is so immersive. We're translating angular rotation to a mouse that is then translated back into angular rotation. So this means that there isn't really a smallest resolution with gyro. The only real hard limit is the maximum speed that a gyro can detect, which for a PlayStation 4 controller is about 2000 degrees per second. The issue gyro has, though, is that the data is messy, or to be more accurate, it's noisy. Here I've set up this example. Let's say this sine wave here represents the actual motion you're trying to make with your controller, like you're waving it back and forth, left and right, up and down. In a perfect world, a gyroscope should be able to track this perfectly like we see here. The problem is, a gyro sensor isn't perfect, it's noisy. And so the data that a single gyro has basically looks like this. It follows the motions we're doing, but it's noisy. You can even see the noise here in Steam input with all of the random motions of the gyro. It's one of the reasons why we need to calibrate our gyro. And if you were to take these values here at face value, then what we should be seeing is about 0.1 degrees of random jitter in game. But of course, that's not what we see, and I'll show you in a bit why. To actually test and see whether or not jitter actually has a noticeable effect at different sensitivities, I went ahead and set up these following examples. Without zooming all the way in, at 1:1, there's basically no visual difference whatsoever. Because at 1:1 calibration, the noise is still relatively small. Quite literally microscopic. The actual jitter that you should be seeing here is 0.00056 degrees, which is still way smaller than the angle skipping that we've calibrated to. Or at least it should be, with a perfect gyro in a perfect environment, because if I zoom way in to 2 degrees horizontal, we can see that the crosshair does randomly move every now and again at 32 and 16. So this means that the noise is high enough already that it is accumulating enough to randomly move the crosshair every now and again. Although at 1:1, visually, this still isn't much of a big deal. So once we start scaling up from one of these points, then we can really see a difference. And so, yeah, if you plan on playing at high flat sensitivities, this is something you'll have to look out for. Because what's happening here is that the angle skips is essentially hiding the noise that actually is there. So here's one last extreme example. At a sensitivity of 10:1, each of these settings basically looks the same. And that's because noise scales linearly with sensitivity. So the noise is there. It's just that the angle skips is hiding it. Because Steam input scales at the software level, there's not really anything actually being done to the hardware itself. It's just a matter of balancing the noise to the angle skips. So then, if noise and random jitter is the source of inaccuracy for gyro, how do we counter it? Well, that's where Alpakka came up with their idea. You just use more gyro. So, if you have one gyro with a noisy signal, and you combine it with another gyro with a noisy signal, you can actually average the two out, creating a third average signal. And the neat thing about this is it reduces the noise by up to 30%. So it's kind of hard to see here, but this is a lot more accurate than one gyro by itself. And to understand why this works, let me give you a couple of analogies. By sheer coincidence, I happened to be looking into dice averages recently for reasons. And I realized that this kind of shows what's going on. So if we're rolling a 1d6, you can think of this as representing sort of the chaotic signal we're receiving from one gyro. It's very noisy. It's very random. However, if you introduce a second gyro, this means we produce a more consistent signal, or in this case, we increase the average output. And this is basically what's going on. By averaging two random signals that are very similar to each other, we can produce more consistent results. And you theoretically could keep scaling this. So like 3 gyros, 4 gyros, and so on. But it's diminishing returns, and setting up more than 2 gets really complicated, almost like a 3-body type situation. Another way to think of it is more musically. Well, not exactly the same thing. There's a very similar principle with guitar pickups. If you have a single coil pickup, this picks up a lot of detail from the strings when you strum. Problem is, it picks up a lot of detail, including a rather annoying hum. So something guitarists figured out a long time ago is that if you use 2 single coil pickups next to each other in opposite orientations, this cancels out the hum. Hence why they're called humbuckers. So it's kind of a similar thing, although not exactly the same. By using 2 pickups together instead of just 1, you get a cleaner signal. So yeah, it seems like Alpakka nailed it. Double gyro should just be the standard. You can see the difference for yourself on this chart that I had GPT make for me while researching all of this. And so going back to the PlayStation 4 controller, I went ahead and did a couple of more tests to see if there actually is a difference between different dot for 360 settings. So because it was requested, I went ahead and tested 2 settings, 10,000 dots per 360 and 32,000 dots per 360. Essentially, all I'm comparing is the averages of these 2 different settings. To try and make sure that there isn't too much bias, I actually alternated between the 2. So I did 10 with 10,000, 10 with 32, and then 10 more with 10,000, and 10 more with 32. So hopefully, the averages at the end will show any differences between using higher dots per 360. Now, being honest, I haven't done AimLab since, well, I last played AimLab, since I've just been testing things out on the field. Also, I've been playing at some fairly high sensitivities, so when it comes to these tasks, I'm pretty rusty. Just putting that out there now. Okay, so 3,000 points is something. Although it is possible this is still within the realm of human variance. And at 1-to-1 calibration, as I've shown earlier, I can't really say that the noise is solely to blame for this difference. I think this has to do a lot more with angle skipping than noise instead. So to explain to you why, let me go back to my spreadsheet. So down at my angle skip section, I had a number written here, 21,600 dots per 360. I completely forgot to mention this, but while the number over here represents the relative angle skip our eyes can see, this number down here represents the actual angle skipping of the game world. And so if you calibrate your sensitivity to 21,600 dots per 360, this is exactly the human limit, because we have 60 steps per degree, which is equal to 1 arc minute, which is the limit of human vision. So if you want an immersive experience, then 21,600 dots per 360 is the maximum sensitivity you'll need to play at. Anything higher than that for hip fire is overkill. All right, tangent time. It has been a well-known fact since the invention of film and the light bulb that the bare minimum frame rate needed to trick your brain into perceiving a smooth image is exactly 48 frames per second. This is known as the flicker fusion threshold because at 48 frames or 48 hertz, a flashing light bulb to a human eye will appear like a constant stream of light. And when it comes to film, 48 frames per second will give you realistic, smooth motion. Now, the film industry settled on using half of that number, probably just to save on film. And as far as our human brains are concerned, that's still more than enough to perceive a smooth image, at least for film. And so I bring this up because I think something similar is probably happening with our dots per 360. So if 21,600 dots per 360 is the bare minimum needed for true, realistic, smooth motion, then perhaps we can cut that in half and still be fine. And if you do divide that in half, guess what? You wind up at 10,800 dots per 360, basically 10,000 dots per 360. And we have exactly half of the resolution. And relative to our real human vision, our eyes can't really see the difference. So by cutting it in half, I think we're kind of inducing some sort of artificial stability. And so if you really are adamant of avoiding high sensitivities, just to be safe, I added some more calculations here. So now, relative to your viewing distance and your in-game FOV, this is the bare minimum sensitivity you would need for smooth motion. As long as you're above this number, you should be fine at hip fire. And I keep saying that because there was a reason why I personally settled on just cranking it up to 32,000. And so next, underneath that, I'm just giving you the average sensitivity between your minimum sensitivity and the realistic limit. So this number should basically guarantee that you have a smooth experience. And so now let me show you why I kind of settled on just cranking the sensitivity up. So one of the main factors into why I settled for just increasing the dots per 360 is because of ADS scaling. So there are two kinds of ADS scaling, linear and focal length. Here I'm going to show you an example of linear, since it's the most common style. If we have a starting horizontal FOV of 90, and our ADS FOV is 45 degrees, then this means with linear scaling, we are cutting our sensitivity in half. And in AimLab, this is called monitor distance scaling. And for horizontal sensitivity, you would set this to 100%. And that's linear scaling. It's simple and effective because it makes your ADS sensitivity feel the same as your hip fire sensitivity. Because you've got to realize, games are selling you on a fantasy. The fantasy of perfectly stable aim when you aim down sights. And both linear scaling and focal length scaling help sell this fantasy. And if you're wondering, focal length is a lot fancier than linear, but in my opinion, it's kind of pointless since linear already does a really good job of simulating the same feeling crosshair at various FOVs, which is probably why AimLab doesn't even have the option listed here. And so with linear scaling, you're pretty much guaranteed never to notice any angle skipping ever when you aim down sights, because the angle skipping is getting scaled down with your FOV. And so those are the two main options. However, there is a third secret option, and that's no scaling whatsoever. So for this example, let's say we're using a sniper rifle at around 14 degrees. And if I disable monitor scaling, I can now enter the secret third option. So for our ADS sensitivity, we're just going to use the exact same sensitivity as our hip fire. So now, when we aim down sights, we are going to see true, realistic aim as it would be in real life. And this is part of the reason why I explained all that relativity stuff in the first video. Because if you ever plan on doing this, then you will need your dots per 360 to be high to reduce the angle skipping that you will see at these kinds of zoom levels. Now, this is honestly something I haven't actually fully committed myself to, because committing to no scaling, in my opinion, is only possible if you use mouse acceleration. Because at higher and higher sensitivities, you really start to notice the shakiness when you aim down sights. And so I think I'll go ahead and save this topic for like a future video. And with all that said, I'll go ahead and move on to the final part of the video, which is all about acceleration. Again. So here's a replay of a run I got while I was trying to warm up for the dot per 360 test. And I'm showing this because AimLab's replay system kind of perfectly highlights exactly what we're trying to do with Accel. The heat trails that we see here basically show us the speed that we're actually flicking towards a target. And man, I kind of wish there was a way to actually get the data here straight out of AimLab, because I would love to know what these speeds are. Anyways, what this is showing is that when we're flicking to wide targets, obviously we're flicking quickly, but as we approach our target, we slow down. So fast flicking is green and slow micro adjustments are red. And essentially, that behavior is what we're trying to take advantage of when we use Accel. But of course, Accel isn't just something that you turn on and then it magically solves all your problems. It's something that you have to learn how to use. And so I've set up a few following tests to hopefully show the differences in different types of Accel and how it ultimately affects performance. So to start off, the task I chose for this is Scattershot, because Scattershot does a really good job of simulating the actual aim you do in real games, where you acquire a target and then you line up the headshot. And to begin, I'm establishing a baseline here of 1-to-1 with no acceleration. For this series of tests, I did 10 runs back-to-back with each style, with the exception being the one after this, but I'll explain in a bit. And so the idea is that this run is likely to have the highest score. And when I switch to using a higher sensitivity with mouse acceleration, the goal is to have a score that is as close as possible to this average. So I accidentally did all these runs, but I forgot to establish an average for playing at a high flat sensitivity. Currently, I'm playing at 6.71, and so if the 1-to-1 average should have the highest score, logically, this high average should have the lowest score. And I'd just like to say this here. In a closed, perfect environment like AimLab, yeah, high sensitivities are manageable, but what you can't really see in the footage here is just how much effort I'm putting into stabilizing my aim. Because gyro sensitivity is a lot like a Chinese finger trap. The more shakiness you see on screen, the more your brain reacts to that shakiness, and it tells your arms, hey, we need to stabilize this aim, let's tense up. And so your muscles tense up, and the irony is, this can actually make your aim shakier. So it's a death spiral loop, which is why I feel that at high sensitivities, some form of stabilization is necessary. So to start off, I went ahead and tested Steam Input's precision speed first. For all of these tests, I'm going to be using a target speed of 3 degrees per second, because that's close to what I'm currently simulating. So I'm not sure if this is visible in the footage, but what I experienced here is that every now and again, I'll overshoot targets, especially when I go for the micro adjustments after hitting the big target. And this is what I was describing in the first video. So it's almost like this style does too good of a job of making the sensitivity feel flat, which at lower sensitivities is fine, but I am a high sensitivity player. So before I continue on to the following tests, I would like to explain a couple of quirks of that program I made because I never intended for this thing to be the solution. What I want is a native implementation of something like this. And there's two major problems with this program. The first is, when you actually use it in game, every now and again, mouse movement will just randomly cut off. So that's kind of a big problem. The second problem is, in game, I cannot lower the sensitivity below 1:1. Because for some reason, the game is still receiving raw input level from Steam Input and Joyshock Mapper. So for all of these following tests, in order to actually simulate the correct sensitivity, I'm lowering the base gyro here to 0, which actually gives us a 1:1 sensitivity in-game. And for the target sensitivity, I subtract 1 from the target sensitivity. So instead of 6.71, I use 5.71 here. So just keep that in mind for all of these following tests. And so first up for the curve types is natural. Now, I think I've already said everything I need to say about it in the first video, so hopefully the following results will speak for itself. And I am biased, I can't deny that, because I do find the smooth transitions from low to high sensitivity to be way more comfortable. Because if there's one thing I don't enjoy, it's when control is taken away from me. And in a way, precision speed kind of takes control away from me. With acceleration, what we want is to be in control of every step of every speed. And when precision speed does the autocorrect thing, that takes control away from you. When you're on a good Accel curve, with practice, you control where you land on that curve. So next up is linear, the most common type of acceleration that people will first experience before they turn it off and never use it again. So I think I've already said everything that needs to be said in the first video, because counterintuitively, straight lines are almost never the ideal choice in nature. It's a recurring pattern that when the easiest solution to something seems to be a straight path, more often than not, that's completely wrong. And so what I think you'll see here is that the results will reflect this common recurring pattern. So the next curve is going to be power, but for context, I'm using a target speed of 30 degrees. This is because the power curve has an insanely aggressive ramp at the beginning. So in order to actually simulate like the correct starting sensitivity, I need to use a higher number for target degrees. And this gets me pretty close to about 3 degrees per second. Also, while I'm here, I'm using an exponent of 0.125. This number isn't really anything special. All I'm doing is I'm dividing 1 multiple times to get to this number, so let me show you. If you use an exponent of 1, you get a straight line to infinity. If you divide 1 by 2, you get 0.5. And this still gives us a fairly steep curve, but it is actually curved now. So divide that again. And we're getting closer to a flat line. And so if we divide 1 more time, we now have a decently flat line. So that's where these settings are coming from. So while we're on the topic of power, I'm pretty sure this is what Steam Input is using for its old settings, because I know it's confirmed that Valve likes to use power curves for CSGO and other stuff they make. So it only makes sense they would also have done the same thing for Steam Input. And by the way, when I said that I used to play at 3:1, what I actually meant was I played at 1:1 with Steam Input's old high mouse acceleration. And the 3-to-1 is still just a guess from my end, because I don't really know what the settings actually are. I'm just guessing. And finally, we're at Sigmoid. And Sigmoid is extremely similar to Natural. So to actually test a difference from Sigmoid to Natural, I'm using an offset of 1.5. I actually changed my mind about what I said about offsets in the first video, because I accidentally misrepresented the example that I showed, because I left the starting base sensitivity at 0. So the spike isn't as bad as I showed it in the first video, so that's my bad. And anyways, I realize it's just better to have more options just in case people do find a use for those settings, so keeping an offset settings for all the other curves is fine. By the way, as for this run, a noticeable difference I feel because of the offset is that my aim actually feels stickier. It's sort of like an artificial type of friction, something you would experience with a mouse pad. And here are the final results. Again, keep in mind, this is with a mouse Accel program that barely works. If I had a native implementation of this, I would test this more thoroughly, but either way, I think these results speak for themselves. However, what mouse acceleration gives us in precision, it also takes away in tracking, at least in theory. So I'll now cover that next. So for these next tests, I'm going to be testing 360-degree tracking. And I'm only showing this test run here because my computer is really starting to show its age. For some reason, this task just tanks my frame rate, and there's massive input latency. And so I'm only including this footage here, so that way you can see what I'm doing with my hands. Because this task essentially shows why I came up with the wrist arc. The games I play tend to require a lot of long-range precision that can randomly swing to close-range fights. Another thing I'd like to bring up is that this task also made me realize that for this type of tracking, player space is kind of the way to go. There's something about laser pointer that can throw off horizontal tracking when you do wide flicks. So I actually realized player space is the better choice here. Alright, so from here on out, I can only show you replays, so sorry about that. And so what we first need to do, just like before, is establish a baseline. So if mouse acceleration does indeed destroy tracking, then the average we establish here is the target we want to reach. And so something I'd like to bring up here is that tracking with gyro is honestly very easy, because unlike mouse, we're not dealing with any friction. That's not to say that it's better than joystick though, because aim assist has perfect tracking. And, well, I'm going to make a whole standalone video about that topic. Okay, so just like before, precision speed is first. And because of the way this style works, the results here should be similar to using a flat sensitivity. And so, unless the target happens to be moving exactly 3 degrees per second, which would make tracking it basically impossible because of the auto-correcting. Tracking with this style is perfectly fine. In fact, the results are actually kind of interesting, and is something I honestly wasn't expecting to see with this style. Okay, before I continue on to the next runs, I want to give you a bit of a pop quiz. So on the screen right now, I have a red dot at 1 second at a position of -10 degrees. At 2 seconds, the dot is at 0 degrees. So, where will the dot be in 3 seconds? Obviously, the dot will be at 10 degrees at 3 seconds. Now, I want you to think about how we actually came to that conclusion, because we don't actually know what speed the dot is moving. So in order to calculate that answer, we measured the change of position that the dot experienced in regard to time. So this means what we measured is velocity. So if you remember everything that I said in the first video about Accel, I want you to keep in mind that everything we did with Accel is to improve the experience we have in regards to velocity. So I just want you to keep that in mind for the next part. All right, next up is Natural. And honestly, I don't really have much more to say, so I'm just gonna let this play out. Accel is like a paintbrush. If you've been using a pencil your whole life and you suddenly try to use a paintbrush like a pencil, you're going to hate it. Just like any tool, to get the best results, you got to practice with it. And you need to adapt to the way that it responds to your inputs, not the other way around. And just like a paintbrush, you'll have to decide for yourself whether or not it actually matches your style of what you're trying to achieve, because there are differences. And thanks to these results, I think I can explain to you what the biggest difference is. Because if there's one result out of this lineup that threw me off the most, it was power. Because if any curve should have come out with a decent score, I was honestly expecting power to be one of those, since I'm fairly confident that's what I was training with when I used to use Steam Input's old Accel. So just like I explained in the first video, velocity is what determines what we experience, because that is what our brain is effectively using when we track targets. So with the power curve, the velocity we experience is always curved. Now, when you compare that to a natural curve, this means there's a point where our brain starts interpreting velocity as a flat linear thing, which makes it more predictable and easier to maintain. And so when a target is moving at a certain speed, this means that it's trickier for our brains to nail the exact velocity that the target is moving. And if we rotate our controller just a little bit faster or slower, yes, when you're on this slope, tracking targets does become harder. This is why the biggest area of concern for Accel is at the beginning. Because even on a natural curve, you're going to wind up with a situation where slow-moving targets are going to be somewhere here on this slope. And if you're even just a little bit off, that can throw off your tracking. And so this is the biggest balancing act that we have to try and figure out with Accel. Because there's two ways to use Accel. You can either stabilize your sensitivity by lowering your starting point, so below 1:1, all the way down to 0. And yeah, that gives you a very stable sensitivity, but it also gives you a steeper slope. And so alternatively, you can just use a bigger target degrees per second. But then this is the caveat that you're increasing the likelihood that a target is going to be on that slope. So it's a balancing act. And so I actually did 4 more runs that just so happened to show one aspect of this balancing act with target degrees per second. So these next runs aren't averages. These are literally just 4 runs that I did back to back. But the results just so happen to show like the exact correlation that I would have expected anyways. So in this first run, the target I'm using is 10 degrees per second. And this feels basically the same as my 3-degree setting. So there isn't much difference here. At 20 degrees, my crosshair is starting to feel nice and stable. I don't really have to exert a lot of effort to keep my crosshair from shaking on the screen. At 30 degrees, I'm beginning to feel the negative downsides of using a larger target speed. Because if the target speed is too large, well, you might as well just use a lower sensitivity, because you're increasing the odds that your sensitivity is going to be low when you're tracking a fast target, which kind of defeats the entire purpose of using Accel. And on top of the low sensitivity, the target you're tracking is also going to be on the slope. And so now at 40 degrees per second, I'm really starting to feel the negative downsides of using a large target speed, because what you can't see in the replay is what's going on with my hands. At this speed, I am constantly on the edge of my wrist arc, because for all of these runs, I haven't needed to actually reset my gyro position at all. And at these speeds, I'm getting pretty close. And so what I'd like to clarify about something that I said in the first video is that if you're using your flick speeds or your trigger speeds, what I really meant is to use those measurements as a point of reference. So if you're using your maximum flick speed, divide that down until you find a comfortable sensitivity. So like just a random number, let's say you're at 200. You don't want the slope to be in your full range. At the bare minimum, you want it to be at half of that. So divide that by 2. And if that's too heavy, divide again. And just keep repeating the pattern until you find a comfortable sensitivity. So I should have clarified that in the first video, but hopefully now you understand what I meant. And there you have it. Although I would like to say this, something to keep in mind about AimLab and, well, different games, is that you can optimize your settings specifically for one task. And that's what a lot of people actually do in AimLab. When you see insanely high scores in certain tasks, that's because those people have specifically set up their settings for that one specific task. So you got to be sure to test out your settings in more than just one scenario if you plan on actually using them in a real game. Okay, one last thing before I go. Because I did bring up the whole cycloid thing, I went ahead and set this up to see if it actually would work for a curve. Turns out it doesn't. A cycloid is pretty weird, but either way, I think my analogy still stands. It's just the common recurring pattern in nature that curves often work better than straight lines. Alright, I hope that clarifies some things. I wasn't really planning on these videos being so long. The first video only turned out so long because I tried to cover everything in one go, and then this video turned out long because, well, I needed to update some things. And shoutouts to Meneth and Play Controller. Your feedback helped me to update some of those things. And so yeah, it seems like I will keep updating my spreadsheet. I don't know, maybe I'll add a config page eventually. For now, I think I probably will be streaming more, and any new videos I make will definitely be shorter. And yeah, so if you're interested in more, you already know what to do. And you can catch me on the next one.